So look, I try to approach American politics with as neutral an eye as possible. It's not easy in this very politicized media environment. And I think that part of the problem of why we are in this state of dysfunction is because of the media. Because we are in this world where people get their news from what I would call views sources. And there's a big difference. We know from studies that if you only watch Fox News or you only watch MSNBC, you become more conservative or more liberal. Because you live in an echo chamber where all you hear is a reinforcement of your own political perspective. Now, ideally, you'd all watch the BBC all the time, of course. Ideally, what we would all do is get news from different sources. And we as consumers of news, I think, need to become smarter about how we consume news, because this trend is not going to go away. With the internet, we are going to get ever more explosions of websites that purport to be news but are actually political opinion. And the onus is going to be on us to think, are we getting news or are we getting views? But I do think it's not helpful to the polarization of this country, the media environment in which we live. So I think we can take some control there by looking at our news sources. But there are two other things I think that are also happening in American politics. One is the amount of money, and I mentioned the $2 billion figure, which is probably cheap, actually, for 2016. There is so much money now in American politics that it is hard to imagine that there is not a certain amount of influence buying in the political process. I mean, listen, if I was investing $1 million in a political candidate, I would want to make sure that I got some kind of a return on my investment. I'd be a stupid businessman or businesswoman if I didn't, right? And it is only in America that elections cost this much money. But the other thing that people are telling me on Capitol Hill, you know that congressmen and women now spend a third of their time fundraising. I suspect it's going to keep going up as well. Is that it influences the way they think because they are always conscious of their donors. And that lovely idea of compromise, and you have a system that was built on and for compromise, a presidential system that was built on the basis of compromise, but which is acting like a parliamentary system where the opposition's job is just to say no. That process is influenced by how much money people have to raise from their donors. To give you some sense of how much your elections cost, the last British general election this year cost a grand total of something like $75 million. Now that's bargain basement democracy, right? Compared to the 2 billion odd, and I think that's conservative, that the 2016 election will cost us. So you've got the media, you've got money, but the other thing I think that's behind the polarization is redistricting. It's only something like a quarter of all congressional seats that are actually competitive at the moment. That's not going to be up until the next census, and we just had one ruling from the Supreme Court now on Arizona, just came down yesterday, which is trying to depoliticize that process. In Britain, our districts are drawn up by civil servants. It's a totally non-political process. And I do think that that can help introduce a certain amount of competitiveness into seats and help for that element of compromise. At the moment, there's no impetus for members of Congress who are either in conservative or in liberal districts to try and reach across the aisle. The only thing they're worried about is being primaried. So you have this confluence of factors that is leading to this polarization of American politics. I find it hard to see how we suck some of that out of the system. But what I will say is that when I travel around the country, everyone I speak to tells me they want compromise. There is a huge center in American politics, but it's a silent center at the moment. And I do think if we could get the silent center in American politics to speak up, we could take away some of the megaphone from the extremes. And that might help us get to a position where we could make more sensible decisions. If you look at the need for infrastructure spending, the kinds of things America needs to do, everybody will tell you we should be spending money on infrastructure. It's a huge job creator. Interest rates are ridiculously low. There is no really good argument that I've heard from economists on either side not to have infrastructure spending at the moment. You have internet rates that are 10 times slower here in the United States than they are in either Germany or South Korea. We could be doing something about that. It's very good for business. But you can't do it because of the politicization of the process. Education reform, another thing that's very difficult to do. Entitlement reform, almost impossible to do without political cover from the other side. Something that we definitely need more compromise on for the long run, but which is, if you are a Democrat and you propose some kind of entitlement reform, or a Republican and you propose the same, you're balancing the budget on the backs of seniors. And so nobody will stick their head out. And so we have to have Republicans and Democrats come together. And we have to try and change this dynamic so that we can have an America that can do the things, that can look at education reform, that can, you look at global education polling at the moment, and America is coming in at 25th and 17th in science and writing and reading. That's not okay. We can't be the world's preeminent superpower if we're not educating our children at the same level that other countries are doing at the moment, particularly when China is looking at those kinds of investments. None of this, I don't think, is rocket science. And I also think it's what the American public wants. But we have to get our politicians in Washington to be able to make those kinds of decisions.